Camera's so close to
Yeah,
me.
I know.
How's it feel?
I was gonna hum the song you were doing, but then I forgot it.
Yeah, all right. Well, welcome parents to another conversation. I'm trying to not clap like that. Welcome parents to another conversation starter. Pastor Mario here.
Dawson, the youth leader.
Walker behind the camera.
You were looking at the ground. I thought you weren't gonna introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm a void.
Yeah.
And so,
I'm gonna cut and restart.
yeah. Thank you for joining us for this week's conversation starter. We're excited for this one because we have officially started our new series on the attributes of God. We talked about God's holiness last night. Mm-hmm. It was good. The discussion time was a little hard, and we'll get into like kind of why that was. But talking about God's holiness, I think, was really good and helpful. Mm-hmm. And I think, it was good to start with holiness because as we looked at, during the teaching time, holiness of like God's holiness is what sets him apart as God. Mm-hmm. Like it's his holiness that sets his love apart from any other love that exists, and his compassion apart from, it sets all the other attributes apart, as we were like talking about before this. Mm-hmm. So two things that we learned from God's holiness is that he's completely perfect. Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit about, what is the extent of that perfection? Yeah. Is that just God doesn't make a mistake, or is it like God is incapable of making mistakes? Yeah. I think there's a difference. There's a difference between someone who just does everything extremely well and doesn't make a mistake, and someone who is incapable in their nature to make a mistake. Yeah. And then, all the other things, we just talked about perfection. We also talked about how sometimes it's hard for people to see God or accept him as a perfect God because of all the imperfection that's around us and all the imperfection in our own lives.
Yeah, I think one of the students said that we don't have an example.
Yeah.
So we can't really...
We don't have I think he said a visual example.
Yeah.
Yep. Which is true. I mean, we have the example of Jesus in the scriptures, which is, he is the image of the invisible God, Colossians says. Yeah. But Jesus isn't physically here right now. Yeah. And so it can be very hard, But not only is God completely perfect in his holiness, he's also completely pure. Mm-hmm. And so we talked a little bit about what does it mean for God to be completely pure. We talked about like the difference between gold and pure gold. And how like God does not have any hint of wickedness or temptation or anything that could even be confused with wickedness. Yeah. And again, there's a difference between someone who's very, very good to the point where you just kind of assume that they don't really do bad things, but that they still make mistakes. Yeah. Like I used to get assumed of this when I was like a teenager, because they're like, oh, you don't do drugs and you don't do those things, you must be really good. It's like, well, I mean, you don't know what's happening behind doors. Yeah. But God is like, he is pure. Like he's the definition of what purity is. And so we talked a little bit about that. And those two things define God's holiness. Yeah.
And you gave the good example of his...
Yu-Gi-Oh cards?
Yeah, that was an example.
I'm just kidding.
But how his pureness can't be tainted by... You gave the example of Jesus with the lepers. Like they were worried Jesus would get leprosy, become unclean. Yeah. But he was so pure that he could touch them and he could actually impart his holiness onto them and cure them without it coming back on him. Yeah. So like it's a good encourager that God being holy and pure and other doesn't stop him from coming into our lives and interacting with it. Like we can't taint him.
Yeah. Like, I'm glad you remembered that. Yeah.
Which is a good reminder because you hear about holiness and perfection and pureness, and they're all things we don't have actively. Yeah. And it can be discouraging because it's like, well, how do I interact with God?
A holy, perfect, pure God.
Yeah, and so it can put you down a little bit if you don't have that reminder of like, no, our imperfection doesn't change his perfection.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Then that's and that's what Jesus demonstrated.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus demonstrated that in his ministry because, and we don't have to get into all of like the Old Testament stuff, but like in the Old Testament in Exodus, when God reveals himself as the true God on the mountain, one of the craziest parts is when God says, do not let people touch the mountain, because if they touch the mountain, they will die. That's holiness.
Right.
It's like if unholiness comes into contact with my holiness, the unholiness will be snuffed out.
Right.
And that's why God will tell Moses, like, you want to see my face, but if I show you my face, you will die.
Yeah.
But here on the other hand, when Jesus comes, Jesus allows and demonstrates God's nearness to unholy, sinful, rebellious people. And just like you said, God can interact with unholiness.
Yeah.
And so we talked about that. It's great. Next week, you're talking about self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
That's going to be really good.
Yeah.
Any previews you want to give before?
No, I think I can wait.
All right. I was trying to get you guys a
Yeah.
scoop. So just 2 questions today. And one of the questions, so I'll have you start with the first question. And then we'll talk a little bit about the second question because it's going to piggyback off of the discussion time that we had in youth group.
Yeah.
So first question for the parents, what do you think?
Yeah, so the first one that you can ask, again, yourselves and your students, and this could almost be a running question no matter what we talk about, but just ask them, like, why do you think it's important to study God's holiness? And the word study is just to not have to use like 5 different words there, but like, like, why do we need to know about this, basically? And again, like we mentioned, like, this is a good one to start with because his holiness, his like otherness, is so pure that it affects all his other attributes. Yeah. So the attributes that we do have similarities with, you know, like compassion and even like creativity and stuff, if we didn't understand holiness, we could just downgrade all those attributes of God. Yeah. So if we understand holiness, those become like untouchable. Yeah. And it's very important because we have to have a right view of God. Yep. Or else he's not God in our minds, you know? Yeah. So holiness is so important to start with so that we understand, like, okay, this week we're learning about like the kindness of God. Well, I'm kind sometimes, but God is holy. Yeah. His kindness is pure. Yeah. Mine is not, you know? Yeah. Like, so it's a good base stone for every attribute to come. Yep. So yeah, why is it important that we learn? You said study, which for students, you know, they're in school 8 hours a day, so study is a word that's like, But it's important though. Yeah. It's important to study. And by study, we just mean like to know very well and intentionally know and get to know the attribute of God's holiness. Yeah. So not just, hey, I heard Pastor Mario or Dawson or Jackson talk about this. I know it. Yeah. But it's like, no, I have looked at the scriptures myself. Yeah. I have asked this question. I have prayed about this. Like, I know that God is holy. You know, there's a huge difference. Yeah. So that's what we mean by study. It's not like study in a classroom for 8 hours. Yeah, we're not going to quiz you. Terrible. Right. So that would be a good question for a great just conversation. The second question, so at the discussion time, we had one question that kind of stumped some people because it was a very heavy question. There was a lot to process and we didn't have a whole lot of time. Yeah. I'm hoping that when you have the conversation with your student, whenever it is, with the devotional time, maybe there's a little bit more time to actually hash out what this question is. Yeah. And the question was based off of Hebrews 12, and I'll read it to you right now. Hebrews 12:10, it says, they, like our earthly parents, disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good
in order that we may share in his holiness. And so we talked about, like, I think the question that we asked the students was, what are some examples of what it may look like in your life to share in God's holiness? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a packed question. Yeah. And so, not to mention, in the teaching, I didn't really expound a lot on this part of this.
Right.
And so, I'm going to read another verse to kind of, before I give the question, to kind of give some clarity as to what it means to actually share in God's holiness. Mm-hmm. So Hebrews 13, starting in verse 11, it says, the high priest, Jesus, is what he's talking about, carries the blood of animals into the most holy place as a sin offering, but the bodies are burned outside the camp. Well, that part is not talking about Jesus. That's just talking about the priest. And so Jesus also suffered outside of the city gate to make people holy through his own blood. And so our holiness comes from our faith in Jesus.
Yeah.
That's the only way we're made holy. Mm-hmm. God gives us his holiness. Mm-hmm. And that's what it means to share in the holiness of God. We get to share in God's attribute of holiness by Jesus. Yeah. Now, partaking in holiness practically is kind of hard to
think through.
To process. And so, what was the question? I forgot the question. Sorry, what was the question again?
How...
Oh, that's what it is. Okay. So...
Action.
Yeah.
Timestamp.
So that was the question, right? So what are some practical ways practical examples in our life of how we might practically share? I'm saying practically a lot. Practically.
Do we need another timestamp?
Practically share in God's holiness, right? So one of the things we didn't do is provide other scriptures to help kind of give clarity.
Yeah.
Into the practicals of that. So one scripture that you gave, are you there in your Bible?
Oh yeah, I can get there.
Okay, so 2 Peter 1.
2 Peter. So 2 Peter 1:3.
Yep.
As his divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue.
Okay. So
that narrows it in a little more.
That really helps us, and I should have put that in the discussion card, but I didn't. So during this time, you guys have that verse. Read that. So I would say, read this verse in Hebrews 12. It's Hebrews 12:10. If you want to get really fancy, just read all of Hebrews 12 up to that point. And then read 2 Peter 1.
Yeah.
And that scripture, and then compare and ask yourself or ask your student, all right, what has God given to you that pertains to godliness?
Yeah.
Right? And I want to give examples, but I don't want to give it away.
Right.
But is there anything that God has given to us as his people that would help us to be godly or to walk in holiness?
Yeah.
And I'll just leave it there because I don't want to give it away.
And you can explain to them as well that, just to hone back in on the sharing in holiness, that is sanctification. It's a process we're going through, all things that we could explain further for them, if they're feeling confused by the question.
Yeah. And if they're confused, I'm hoping that with you parents, your student, you know them well, you know how to communicate with them, you guys have hard conversations all the time. Mm-hmm. And so I am trusting that you guys know how to best communicate this, because this is weighty and it's a lot to process. So I'm trusting that you guys know how to communicate in such a way that helps your students be able to process kind of the weight of all of what this is. And again, help reading other scriptures, even if you have other scriptures that come to mind. If you have a study Bible, look up cross-references for the Hebrews 12 passage. If you don't have a study Bible, go online to blueletterbible.com. You got loads of cross-references on there. You can go to BibleHub.com, whatever the case.
Yeah.
Do something to help your student process this. Because this was a stumbling part for a lot of the students, but it was because we didn't have a lot of time to process. We didn't have a lot of time to go through all the scriptures that we could have. And we didn't have enough time in the teaching for me to really expound on what this is and what this means.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. So now you guys have the opportunity to
which is good.
Finish the lesson, as it were.
You finished the lesson, the teaching.
Yeah.
So yeah. Any other thoughts for the parents? No. Any previews you want to give? No. Just kidding. Trying to get something out of you, man.
Yeah.
You're like, nope.
Nope.
It's gold.
Yep.
Pure gold.
They'll hear about it on next Monday.
True. Yeah.
Yep.
So I just pray that these questions would lead to some good conversations for you guys. And I just want to take this time to also just encourage you parents to really encourage your students to come to youth group. I mean, we've had a few students coming, but I can think of a handful of like 5-6 students that we haven't seen in a while. And so I know that everything is busy. I know you guys have schedules, but if you're not busy and your student is just like, don't really want to, I'd rather watch Netflix or do something. Encourage them. Be like, hey, listen, they're going through the attributes of God. They're going to learn about this stuff. This is great stuff. Come, go and hang out. Go do something, right?
Yeah.
So I just want to plug that in to just, actually, we played spike ball.
Yeah.
If your student knows what that is, that was fun.
Yeah.
So that might be available again this coming.
And of course, if you ever get stumped by questions, reach out.
Please reach out. Yeah.
You don't actually have to teach a whole lesson if you don't feel
No, you don't have to teach a whole lesson, but you are the main discipler of your student.
Yeah.
And so I think God expects parents to be able to process this stuff.
Yeah.
Even if it's not perfect, but to at least engage with this stuff with their student.
Yeah.
And so I trust that all of you guys are doing that. And so that's just, this week is just a little bit more to process, that's all. So, again, hope it leads to some great conversation. And next week we'll be talking about, I'm trying not to give it away.
We're landing the plane.
Dawson's teaching.
We're landing the plane for a third time.
That's all right. Yeah. This is the one. We're done. All right, go have the conversation.
Do I need another timestamp?
Hello, parents. This is Pastor Mario. Thank you guys for joining us for this week's conversation starter. If you want more ways that you can engage with your youth, you could check out the other conversation starters here on my side. Thank you guys for joining us. Hope you guys are doing well.